Hey, Thrilling Suspense fanatics. Today, something very special is coming your way. A tale called Long Before Essuin. And this one appears in Thrilling Suspense Fantasy Volume 2. Available via the links in the description below. And, should you choose to support this channel by backing my Kickstarter, available on Kickstarter. So this marks the first time one of my stories will be available on the channel. I'm delighted to bring it to you. Long Before Essuin, by R. Christopher Cornford. You folk of the South don't know a thing about real fear, the balding monk interjected, draining the last drops of ale from his brass-ringed mug and slamming it on the oaken table before me. I don't doubt you've seen battle. I don't doubt you've killed. I know some among you have even felt the unbridled power of a storm at sea, but you don't know true horror the way we in the North know it. You haven't had to live near the Grimwald. No, your forests are clean and young, planted by human hands. Dappled light kisses good-humored creatures, and lovers frolic while picking berries under welcoming boughs. You know nothing of the menace that ancient wilderness exudes, looming at the very edge of civilization. I looked around the table, taking note of the intrigued expressions worn by my now quiet companions. With no travel possible until the snow cleared over the pass, there had been a camaraderie growing between us. Atler straightened his lanky frame as he spoke. I know a thing or two about fear, he smirked. But I'm splitting hairs. Tell us, old man, of your days in the black woods of the Grimwald. For while it is true that I have lived among trees all those years that I have not been at sea, I come from verdant Werclune, whose jungles are humid and bright year-round. We have no bitter cold, no dark days in deepest winter. You see, in a fertile land like mine, danger takes other forms, and, should you all implore me, I might be convinced to share a tale. The night is young, and the dark-skinned youth fixed his burning green eyes on the barmaid. Maya will certainly keep our mugs full of ale and the fire roaring. Davin rested her sturdy hand by a still full mug. Please, do not demur on my account, Malthua. I may be a lady, but I am hardier than most men and keener of mind. Malthua shot her a foul look, and sour-faced Sloane, whose squint somehow intensified, did the same. Only 2 of the 5 men at the table. Tunisia was indeed changing. Even here on the eastern frontier, none vocalized any objection to Davin's presence at the table. Besides you, Malthua, I am the only one of us to have traveled the Grimwald. My trade has taken me to no more misbegotten and dreadful a place. But I would still hear of your experiences there, if only to know how they compare to my own. Heavy arms folded across his massive breast, Morven nodded through a bushy black beard. Beside him, Reedy Sloane mimicked the gesture. All eyes settled on me, and I drawled casually, "Oh, I didn't think it needed to be said, but do go on. I assure you I'm most curious." "Very well. Just know I'll have no complaints then, and as few interruptions as you lot can manage." Malthua's grim tone had by this point nearly erased my memory of the jovial fellow who had invited me to dine with the group mere hours before. "I was a young man then," he began, "freshly trained as a monk of the Order of the Crescent Moon. I had been sent north both to gain experience and to assist the various lords of that treacherous place." "Part of the pacification effort, you mean," rumbled Morven. "You came north to put down locals fightin' against the lumber expansion for ships and buildings and the like, for Ilbian 4. We used to work the docks, me and Sloane. We know where things come from, and where they go, and why." Davin cut in. "It's not so simple as that. You wouldn't know about the North, how dangerous it was if you weren't there to see it. Now, at least, the roads are safer. The farmers still tell superstitious tales, but—" "I'll say it outright. I came to stamp out heathendom. Even now, pagan rites proliferate in the countryside. The Order should never have softened its stance against the old ways." Malthua clasped his hand in the air, as if gripping tightly to something. "We were so close. We wanted to bring civilization to even the most far-flung, the most backward provinces in Tunisia. The deviltry I saw in Essuin, in Challer, in Pendridge, holy Jotan, Sky Father of the Four Winds, protect me." "Well, never mind for now what you were doing exactly. Go on, tell us what happened there," croaked Sloane. Morven drained his mug and folded his arms again. "I arrived first in Essuin, riding for the chateau of Lord Eremain. Though the town held chapels and a university, and was rich from mines of silver, it felt tiny in comparison to the endless forests that stretched up the blue-gray peaks to the north. Serving men welcomed me, and before long I joined Eremain at his table. He was a good host, if a bit eccentric, and took pains to make me aware of certain peculiar circumstances that he feared might worsen any day. And, by the four winds, worsen they would, as I soon found out." Malthua paused to drink deeply from his freshly filled mug, and I caught my breath. I was ever quick to make a sardonic remark, but something in the man's disquietingly haggard look had shaken me from my cynicism. I waited, eager as the rest, for the man to continue. "Eremain told me of queer happenings at the sawmill, of supplies gone missing, and of accidents befalling men working alone. When men left the mill at the turning of the season, accidents began to increase in the mines. Then livestock went missing, and worse, children began to disappear from outlying farms. It went well beyond bandits or rebellious tribesmen, the kind of thing Eremain and his men had handled countless times," he explained. "I saw plainly that he was no coward, and could handle steel as well as any soldier, but something was deeply wrong, so he had contacted the Order, as a good lord should when uncouth forces manifest themselves. I assured him of his righteousness, and foolishly I told him we'd set things right before long." The next morning a sepulchral gloom hung about the whole of Essuin. Stone-faced peasantry watched me make my way from the town toward the sawmill in the weak light of winter morning. Wind whistled and cut against my face as I glared into the wretched forest. Its abysmal ancient darkness seemed to stare back with a palpable malignancy. I got the sense, for the first time but by no means the last, that the forest was aware of my presence. Throughout the day, though I just about turned the place inside out, I identified nothing out of place or even untoward in the mill beyond its strangely overgrown interior and a persistent feeling that I was being watched. Sunset reddened the chilly sky, and I found myself squinting into leafy shadows. Without warning, a thunderous crashing came behind me, and I leapt aside, narrowly avoiding an avalanche of trunks dislodged from one of the great stacks. Their sprawling path deposited them before the inward swinging door through which I had entered from the road, and I had no hope of moving them alone. The construction of the mill was open on two sides, those facing the forest, while a wall of about 8 feet blocked the chillier winds from the river. During the warmer months, 2 men could lower a great ramp from the high stone foundation to the forest floor. However, the gears were positioned on opposite sides of the ramp, and alone I could not turn both. I surmised the height of the foundation to be about twice my own. Resolving to leave with the waning light, I lowered myself carefully down the stone wall. As my arms came to full extension, something sinuous and wet wrenched my fingers from their grip. I tumbled the remaining distance, twisting my ankle with the fall. I rose, feigning sure-footedness, and drew my battle-hammer before me. "Show yourself, fiend!" And I heard the hollowness, the smallness of my own voice swallowed by the impenetrable shadow of the Grimwald. As wolves strike for injured prey first among the herd, I knew whatever was there with me in the mill would be searching for weakness, eyeing me with predatory cunning. I resolved to hide my injury at all costs. It was then that I noticed a faint humming, and I knew it had begun long before I perceived it. At first I could not place the direction, but as I wheeled about, it seemed to come from all sides at once. A multiplicity of voices, each barely audible, blended into an eerie buzz, thickening to a distorted echo of the songs of summer insects. With the same subtlety that I had noticed the ghastly humming, I became aware of heavy breathing. I held my breath, thinking at first that the panting was my own. Though I could isolate the pounding of my heated blood against my ears, the breathing continued unabated. Deliberately, I made my way around the foundation of the mill, ever keeping my back to the stone. The crunch of sticks and needles under my boots was strangely muffled and more distant than it should have been, yet that murmuring and breathing seemed at times to be just beside me. The effect was disorienting, and further compromised my balance. Trying as I might to stay calm, I felt cold sweat weaken my grip on the shaft of my hammer, streaks staining my tunic and wetting my brow. I steeled my nerves on rejoining the road, and I returned to the village in the blue darkness that follows twilight. The farther I got from thickest growth, the less I felt removed from normal perception. Footfalls sounded as they should, and I was greatly reassured by the normal sounds of rural life, by lit braziers and warm windows, and by the sturdy stonework of the chateau toward the center of Essuin. I was pleased to find my host still up and about, having only recently dined. Lord Aramain welcomed me to sup, and enjoined me to tell him of my experiences in the mill. He listened most sympathetically to my ordeal, then bade me join him in the study to further discuss matters in the comfort of rare vintages and his roaring hearth. Over one of the finer wines I have tasted, even to this day, Aramain told me of an old friend of his who had worked for long decades in the university as an alchemist, one Magister Adolf Gratzen. The two had become estranged from one another, partly through the normal course of divergent occupations, but also because of what Aramain described as the man's obsession with the Grimwald. Being an alchemist, he was of course obligated to scour the land for its minerals, flora, and other substances. A cursed profession, if ever there was one among honest men. It is the perverse duty of the alchemist to learn all there is to know about any land, about the reactive properties of its unique features, and, to some degree, about the local uses for such things, if for no other purpose than as a starting point for further inquiry. Malthua paused, looking away from us briefly. A cloud of mixed emotion, part regret and part hatred, moved across his weathered face. Inhaling sharply, he began anew. Perhaps the Grimwald would reap its toll on any man, for no alchemist has worked so close to its borders since the time of Gratzen. But I get ahead of myself. I, too, have heard that breathing in the forest. Davin's tone was low and husky, tinged by melancholy. I lost many good men the night I heard it first. She broke off, and I thought she must have lost someone dear, for her grief was evident. Tell me, did you learn of its cause? I'm afraid not, Davin. At least, never clearly, though I have certain unmentionable guesses. The next morning we traveled to the university. Aramain was somber and hesitant, as if concerned about what we might discover. While the chateau was of the older architectural style, the university was recently constructed, with all of the geometric regularity, the uniformly cut and smoothed limestone that characterizes newer styles. It was a harsh contrast to the charming irregularity of the stonework of Lord Aramain's home. Foul places, universities. Distortions of the abbey system, nothing more. He shot me a fiery look, likely supposing that I might object. "I don't begrudge you that opinion, Malthua," I said. "For better or for worse, I am a product of the university. No doubt it is evident in my speech and fashion, but I will not be offended, for having spent a number of years in the stone halls of southernly Gunatir, I am well acquainted with its iniquities. Please, continue." "A low-ranking fellow in tawny robes took us to the northernmost tower where Gratzen kept his laboratory. And it was well that we arrived as soon as we did. His assistant, Amesley, was in a dreadful state, ghastly and pale. We discussed matters in the antechamber of the laboratory, which served as a most impressive library. Briefing him on these matters only served to worsen his agitation, and the poor fellow stammered so terribly that it was difficult to understand his queer tale. The previous night, at about the same time I was finishing my search of the mill, they had begun an experiment of great significance to Gratzen's research. Amesley struggled through the barest outlines of his story, which was much clarified when he showed us the wreckage of the laboratory proper. Through great oak doors we entered a chamber overgrown with mosses and plants of all sizes, some of which were local to the Grimwald, and others to more remote places and climates. The strangest were a series of dark flowers, growing in glass beakers above a row of heated stones under the double-paned windows of the far wall. Their thick fronds and midnight petals sweated obscenely, the residual moisture fogging the glass. Vines extended out of a shattered pot and wrapped fully around an inclined wood panel of sufficient size to hold a man. Amesley gestured towards the iron shackles to confirm to us its usage. In the side of the shattered pot, a whitish root system culminated in an odd egg-shaped sac above the soil. It was partially translucent, and looked almost as if some purple hand clasped its fingers tightly below the membrane. The tendrils extending from the sac wrapped around the roots of the vine growth, and when I looked closely, I saw whitish veins of the stuff, through to the vines about the panel. Amesley had been strapped into the contraption as a part of their experiment, and had lost consciousness partway through the procedure. He had evidently only recently returned to his senses, and his nervous condition was in part due to his harrowing experience. Gratzen had been pursuing the most potent nectars and saps of the region when he stumbled upon those midnight blossoms, and from that same species, Amesley insisted, had come the upsetting sounds I'd heard the night previous. I listened at the beakers and could hear nothing, which Amesley explained was the intended result of their procedure. I noted the bluish tinge of his lips and his pallor again, and recalled that men whose humors had been adjusted by leeches shared a similar look. Gratzen had refused to explain the full scope of his conjecture to Amesley, who did confirm his blood had been drawn to some purpose when I put it to him directly. He could not explain why, and directed us to Gratzen's notes. The alchemist's cramped script filled page after page, and made constant use of abbreviations, runic designs, and codes that were indecipherable to us. With the dubious help of his assistant's recollections, we were able to piece together something of the present situation. Gratzen had departed for the Grinwald in the wee hours of the night, considering his work with Amesley to be conclusive, and had made sufficient preparations to camp there for some days. His writings alluded to something else, something horrid which I dare not consider even now, for its mere recollection gnaws at my faith. Adler, who had been quiet and still to this point, interjected hotly. "But what happened, man? There is a sketchiness to your storytelling, an irresoluteness that bothers me. I am no monk, nor supernaturalist of any sort, and I would prefer to consider the material facts of the situation. When Amesley recovered, surely you could have had it straight from him." "I'll second Adler. Tell us directly, monk," croaked Sloane. "Maya, another round." "Amesley was not with us long, but, by the grace of Edelin, save your questions for the last. I am sure now that Ainsley's blood had been drained to the plants in the lab, that they had tested him, found him appetizing even, that he must have heard that murmuring far more clearly than I, for he eventually heeded its call. There, I've said it, though it pains me. Malthus snarled, draining the last of his mug just in time for Maya to fill it again. Now, where was I? There was but one thing for us to do at that point, go in after Gratzen. Eremaine, Ainsley, and I made ourselves ready to head into the wood, reinforcing the binding around my still sore ankle. Ainsley insisted that the alchemist was in danger of some sort, which Eremaine was more than willing to believe. Little did we know of what awaited us in the perpetual dusk beneath that frightful canopy of ancient secrets. Naively, we set out the next morning in good spirits. Eremaine and his 2 men, being accomplished hunters, knew how to read the forest well enough for us to navigate by Ainsley's shaky directions. By midday, the sun was mostly obscured by the thick branches. We moved in the twilight of that unwholesome place, wending our way between the massive trunks and over needles and fallen leaves. Night had already fallen below the trees as the sun set over Essuin, and we lit torches accordingly. Flickering shadows danced and marched alongside us, playing tricks on my tired eyes. I was relieved to see that we neared a clearing of some kind, and I could just make out a circle of trees silhouetted by the light of the newly risen moon. Ainsley suddenly stiffened, as though he heard something. Eyes wide, he asked if we could make anything out. I strained and heard only the creaking of the cold forest. We put out our torches, and Ainsley, in a fit of stuttering terror, urged us to move with utmost caution. We took a circuitous path around the raised mounds, which Ainsley regarded with particular revulsion. Each was about as tall as a man, and from the top of each grew clusters of mushrooms and partially translucent egg-like sacs that glistened wetly in the blue moonlight. Finally, as we approached the circle, a hoarse voice barked at us from the darkness. "Turn back, you fools!" Eremaine cried, "Adolf! Adolf! We've come to rescue you from this nightmare." "I need no rescuing. What I need is for you to go. Now! This is no place for men such as yourselves." His voice was strained, as if he were supporting some great weight as he called out. "Ainsley, the time grows short. The moon has nearly ascended. You must show them out of here." But, sir, if you remain here, the flowers will—" "Ainsley, get them out!" The final syllables boomed with uncanny resonance, sending echoes into the forest. And when those echoes returned, they brought on their heels that uncouth humming and breathing. This development horrified the 5 of us, though the alchemist's assistant took it worst. He broke out in profuse sweating and began to roll his eyes wildly. Then, with a burst of heretofore unseen explosiveness, shrieked and sprinted headlong for the circle. "By Jotan, by the Emperor's grace, by the proud bear that is the crest of Eremaine!" The Lord's voice trailed off. He looked to the men and I, and we all knew without a word that there was naught to do but continue. I bared my teeth and gripped my hammer tightly, eyes wide and peering about me. The men, may their souls find rest, demanded to head in before Eremaine and I. And good thing they did. I dare say I would not be here today if they had not. The massive gnarled trunks were fused together at the base, curling out and up into shadow. Each was wide across as a cottage, and each had a yawning mouth that faced the center. A stench of decay and dirt wafted out from those shadowy apertures, and though we searched and called out, our only rejoinder was the directionless muttering and whispering. "They must be within one of those damned trees." Eramaine's voice was cold as winter steel. Light the torches, and we'll soon discover alchemist and apprentice both." By the light of our torches we beheld a bizarre scene in the trunk of the closest. The interior of the tree was thickly overgrown with whitish fungal tendrils and protuberances. The horribly textured growths obscured the bark of the walls and the forest floor below us, slowing our progress further. Four winds carry me. What we saw yet burns in my dreams. Amongst the whitish organic shapes I made out a human skull. Gasping, I began to discern bones all around us. The tendrils, mushrooms, sacs, and other sinister night forms of that diabolical fungi grew from the remains of man and beast alike. Black flowers, like those in the jars in the alchemist's laboratory, sprung from the fresher carcasses. Casting my torch about in a final survey and finding no sign of Gratson or Amesley, I broke first from that terrible trunk. Shortly, we made the second. In it we saw more of the same, though the remains within were fresher still. 3 pigs and, I shudder to remember, the corpse of a child were host to finger-like eruptions from eyes and mouth, and those tendrils of white laced in and out of skin, clothing, and fur. We pulled away from the grisly scene as quick as we could. The third was quite different, though it was similarly infested by fungi. A tunnel of some sort led dimly downward, and from it we heard muffled rhythmic speaking. That humming and breathing had come to disorient me again, and I was glad to follow behind Eremane's men on shaky legs. The air was thick, and tiny clouds of fungal powder exploded with every step. Breathing it in worsened the effect of confusion and disorientation, and again my senses seemed strangely distant. Eremane's men disappeared around a corner before us, and when we rounded it after them, we were alone in that dismal place. Our torches revealed a bed of mushroom caps receding into further darkness. Ever so carefully, we moved forward in the crushed cap footprints of the Lord's men. Eremane, in a moment of dizziness, stepped on a fresh patch, and a cloud of that spore dust puffed around him. He staggered as if drunk, and I caught him about the shoulder. Even as we moved to the edge of the bed, he began to lose consciousness. I propped him against the veiny dirt wall of the tunnel and continued my spiraling path downwards. Shortly after losing sight of Eremane around a sharp corner, I was tackled viciously to the ground. One of the men, Dalton, straddled me and raised a mailed fist high. His eyes were milky white and inhuman, or so it seemed by that flickering light, and I brought my hammer against his cheek without thinking. His face collapsed, and I pushed him away. As soon as I was on my feet, Gertson came at me with the same milky-eyed, slack-jawed look I'd seen on Dalton. He swung his broadsword wildly, and I dodged by pure instinct. I recall it now as if I saw myself, rather than seeing it through my own eyes. We whirled and cavorted in that tunnel, his sword cutting chunks from the wall and sending explosions of dirt with every strike. Though I don't recall the exact moment of it, he cut my left shoulder badly. After a particularly wild swing took him off balance, I smashed my hammer against his hands, and then, when his sword fell away, against his temple. Tendrils of milky fungus formed a delicate lattice along his cheeks, and where the hammer had crushed his skull, I saw further growth in the crimson mess of his brains. Heaving and soaked in sweat, dirt, and blood, I staggered on. The murmuring and breathing was a roar and then a whisper, throbbing in time with the wriggling of the tunnel walls around me. Every detail seemed unstable, twisting and turning into infinitely different and complex patterns. Looking at any one thing was like trying to run along a frozen lake. My mind raced, as without traction as my vision. Drool and sweat built in my mouth, and I must have vomited as I moved, for I noticed the orange bile on my tunic and the new wetness on my chin. I rounded the final corner and found myself at the mouth of a large chamber. Adolf stood in the corner, crouched in front of a massive flower. He turned toward me, a mournful look on his face. "You should not have followed me. I begged Amesley not to come." He cast his eyes to my right, and I saw a crumpled form already erupting in whitish protuberances. All was in place, but no matter. When I walk into the flower, the ancient pact will be satisfied. You'll need to hustle out of here, monk. What are you babbling about, man? What are these devilish plants? I felt lightheaded, and somehow, in the strange confusion of that moment, I knew Adolf did not mean to harm me. His manner was weary but kind. I cannot explain it as precisely as I would like. I still remember his words as if they were yesterday. "You monks, you followers of Jotun, trample over other customs. You call it heathenism, devil worship, paganism. You dismiss too much. The forest has been owed for how many years I am not sure. The people have forgotten their pact, and the forest reminds them in a tongue none can interpret. With Amesley gone, I fear I shall have no successor. Mark my words, monk, the forest will come again for what it is owed. I know you will burn my books, you will raise my instruments and condemn my memory, but time will bear out my words." I stood in stupefaction, trying to keep pace with the furious train of implication that followed his utterances. "The fungal species here is remarkable. It connects animals and plants across the Grimwald in some form of shared sentience. When I step into the flower, this tunnel system will begin to close. The forest will be satiated with my willing sacrifice, and this cluster will release spores that begin the cycle of growth for the flower that will replace it. The fungal being will become dormant, only retaining enough control over the forest to ensure the safe growth of the next flower, and then it in turn shall need sacrifices. How many, I am not fully certain. By the four winds, what manner of sorcery is this?" My blood had risen some, and I had half a mind to make for the alchemist and crush his skull, if only my legs would carry me. "Monk, get out while you can." As he finished those words, he toppled backwards into the flower, its spongy thick petals wrapped around him. All was quiet save for the rustling of his cloak and the occasional snap of a bone. The silence hit me like a battering ram. My feet were steady under me, and even as I looked, I saw the tendrils and fronds that emanated from the central flower shifting and wriggling. Tendrils retracted from the ceiling and began to fold into the flower, loosening small chunks of dust and debris. I knew it was time to run, and run I did. Eremain was coughing where I had left him, and though his legs were worse than mine, we staggered arm in arm, up past crumbling walls caked in spores and dust, up more than half delirious from the horrors of that place, and finally the crisp night greeted us. As we exited the clearing, retracing our steps along the spiral path, the sacks atop those rounded mounds erupted. Slick membranes opened and devilish black tongues lolled glistening around stiff, bone-like stalks. There were other abominations, amalgamations of plant and animal form, living things in some nocturnal reverie that I did my best to ignore. By the grace of Jotun, we made it to Eremain's estate, and we rested. For a time, the forest in Essuin was calm, but, four winds carry my soul skyward, the alchemist was right. Some pact, made long before men called that place Essuin, needs fulfillment once more. Malthua took a final drink from his mug and looked around our little circle. Davin had gone quite pale, and the muscles and tendons of her stern jaw were visible in the dying light of the fire. Atler's hard features were uncharacteristically sympathetic, as if something in Malthua's tale had resonated with him. Morven sat as before, his broad face wearing an unreadable expression. Sloane balanced at the edge of his seat, a strange fire burning in his eyes. He licked his lips, then his words fell out in a jumble. "Look, well, Malthua, you spin a clever yarn, but, and this is important, when you talk about fear, you talk about the forest and old things and horrible things from before civilization. I say we put it to a vote tomorrow night after I tell my tale. Which is worse, the grim-walled and strange happenings of the North, or the horror of civilized men in the South? My tale, I believe, will sway the lot of you." His eyes darted about the circle. "I have no plans to travel tomorrow, and I find myself most intrigued by your proposal. Sloane, I accept." I stood from the table as the others made similar proclamations, then headed to the counter, where Maya waved me away, evidently too drowsy to bother settling accounts this evening. As I retreated up the stairs to my chamber, I heard hushed discussion continue among those still seated. I thought I knew, at least in vague terms, of some of the events Sloane might discuss, and I shuddered at my memory of the work camps and prisons in the heart of Tunisia. That night, my mind whirled with images of black forests and strange fungus, and my dreams were of the very worst memories of my time in the South, of horrible dungeons, cruel deceptions, overcrowded streets, sewage, and depravity. The end. Well, I hope that you have enjoyed this story. I'll be reading at least one more tale from Thrilling Suspense Fantasy during the course of this Kickstarter campaign. But to say a few words about the tale, Tunisia is the northern kingdom in the world of Merku, above the continent of Thyme, which hosts some of the other stories. It is a recently united empire, a vast land, dominated by the imperial power in the south. Old customs are being eradicated by a new religious order, and as that happens, as that shifting happens, a great danger arises. What happens when old ways are abandoned and there is nothing to take their place? When stewardship of the land is destroyed? These were the concepts I had in mind while writing the story. As well, I wished to set up a situation where many tales of horror could be told by the occupants of the inn, at least until the snow cleared. So I've got more stories planned to be told around this table, and I hope you enjoy them. I hope you will check out Thrilling Suspense Fantasy. We're unlocking stretch goals right now for the 3rd volume. Again, this comes from Thrilling Suspense Fantasy Volume 2, which is available for sale right now and is also an add-on for those who would choose to back Thrilling Suspense Fantasy Volume 3. All right, I'll see you in the next video. Have a great rest of your day.